It's time to begin the 37th Annual Symposium on the Lutheran Confessions. We would appreciate it if you would stop breaking the 8th commandment. Reserve that for later. It's the one that's closest to my heart. This is the 37th the Symposium on the Lutheran Confessions, which has very little to do with the Lutheran Confessions.
All 37?
Yeah. But how often, can you imagine, every 2 years, John Pless goes to the Leah Conference someplace in Germany or here. How much can anybody lecture on one person, Wilhelm Leah? But so we have a kind of diversity here. You know, we like all kinds of confessions. And this is the third year that we are proud to present the seminary president, Lawrence Rast Jr. It's kind of difficult for me to do this because once he was a student of mine, and then I think I was the academic dean, and Chuck Eashan still feels guilty about holding my position. But of course, he's more interesting than I am. And when I was in that position, Larry was the assistant. Then he was a clergy person in was it Tennessee? Tennessee, yeah. At Vanderbilt University. And then he came here as an assistant professor. Then he was an associate professor. Then he was the academic dean, kind of equal. And now he's the president. So I am that permanent star in the heavens. And he's the planet. And planet means something which has no determined course through the sky. So we don't know where he's going next, and we really don't care. Hey, listen, it's either me or just. I'm very happy to introduce and welcome our Dr. Lawrence Rast for the first presentation at this symposium. Dr. Rast?
All right. You need a hand down, or are you all right?
What?
You all right?
I'll
okay, be careful. Thank you, Dr. Scare. I was afraid you might break into a chorus of Shooting Star by Bad Company there, and that wouldn't have done us any good at all. My thanks to all of you for taking time out of your busy and demanding schedules, and above all, for braving the cold and snow for the warmth of theological conversation and reflection here at the 37th Annual Symposium on the Lutheran Confessions, David, with the theme, Lutheran Distinctives in an Age of Religious Change. When Dr. Scare first proposed the topic for this year's symposium, I thought something was amiss. You see, he wanted to title our gathering, Lutheran Distinctives in an Age of Decline. Now, there's a lot to recommend such a title, not the least of which is that it captures rather well Dr. Scare's own present realities. But I didn't want this to be simply a symposium about him. After all, the previous 36 have been all about him. And so instead, I suggested that we rename it Lutheran Distinctives in an Age of Religious Opportunity. How's that for a presidential shift there? I admit part of the reason that I proposed this has to do with fundraising. I mean, all of the experts tell us that if your institution is declining, you can't convince people to get out their checkbooks. After all, we all know the process of fundraising. You've got it. We need it. Let's have it. But I'm not getting many takers from you all right now. And so in the end, we settled on what we now have, Lutheran distinctives in an age of religious change. After all, the Lutheran churches of the world are in a period of religious change, no question about that. And as we see the European churches collapsing, frankly, save where remnants of confessionally oriented groups continue to proclaim the biblical gospel, and here in the United States, where we see Lutheranism struggling, the three largest Lutheran church bodies in the U.S., the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the LCMS, and the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod are all experiencing rather significant declines. Nonetheless, there is in the global South an emerging Lutheran church, a burgeoning Lutheran church, a rapidly expanding series of Lutheran churches. And so we can't say decline unless we're being autobiographical. We can't say it's an opportunity unless we're reaching for your wallet. So we settled on change. It seemed safe. Can we get the video up for the presentation? In theory, it is. That's always scary. Dr. Scare, that's like justification. All right. Our purpose is not to exhaust the topic over the next couple of days. Rather, it is to, it came for a moment and now it's gone again. Not to exhaust the topic, obviously. We have speakers from a variety of institutions, from a variety of viewpoints as well, and we're really aiming to unpack this with your help and in the midst of an ongoing conversation with you. In fact, one of the things we were particularly intentional about was making Thursday afternoon the embarrassment stage of the symposium when we ask our speakers actually to predict what will Lutheranism look like in 2025. My expectation, and in fact my hope, is that all of us will be wrong. And I think I'll probably be right on that particular point. And so we boldly jump into the mix and take on the first topic of this 37th annual symposium on the Lutheran Confessions. And I'd like to introduce the speaker, who is me. Thank you. The Missouri Synod is a problem. I did not say it has problems. I said it is a problem, for the historian at least. And we can name that problem this way. Where do you put the LCMS in the larger landscape of American Christianity? Where should we be placed? Well, obviously, we're not Roman Catholic. So, does that make us Protestant? I watched you all wince and shake your heads no when I said that. No, you say, we're Lutheran. But that won't do it for the demographers. They need a category, and Lutheranism is not a sufficient category as far as American Christian demographers are concerned. And so, since we're not Catholic, we get lumped in with the Protestants. So it goes. But there's more. Are we mainline Protestants, or are we evangelical Protestants? Well, we really don't want to be mainline, do we? I mean, the mainline tends, to use my favorite weasel word, the mainline tends to shy away from the historic creedal formulations of the church. Years ago, a family member who had left Missouri for a mainline church wondered whether it wasn't time for us to reinterpret and update the Athanasian Creed. Can't we find a way, he said, to speak in a more inclusive fashion regarding those who have a different conception of the Trinity or of God in general? No, was my answer then and still is. Whether it's one's view of Scripture, human sexuality, gender roles, and even models of atonement, the main line goes where Missouri is not willing. So that leaves us with the evangelical Protestants. No, we cry, we're not evangelicals. Well, at least we're not that kind of evangelical. We're not anti-sacramental decision theologists. We're the real evangelicals, the real gospel people. We have a real presence hermeneutics, at least since this morning. We're evangelical Lutherans. Yes, we are. But that aside, our demographer friends have the last word, and so we find ourselves sitting beside our evangelical Protestant friends in the American Christian dance. And, or perhaps but, we all know dancing is a sin. And so here we are, sitting uncomfortably with our date, not quite sure what to do next. This uncomfortableness has been a hallmark of Missouri since its arrival on the American scene. We were drawn to the United States specifically because of its religious freedom, the confessional freedom that it offered the immigrants. And yet the results of that freedom, every denominational flavor you could possibly imagine, and then some, coupled with, strangely enough, unionistic practices that made such denominational variety superfluous, put Missouri in a very strange spot. Oh, yes, we were German speakers, and that offered a functional barrier of sorts. It certainly cut down on the number of dates we could ask, since we didn't know the language to ask for the dance. But still, we liked America. We liked the freedom that it offered. And we submerged ourselves into that culture. For even the greatest Missourian from our German period, C.F.W. Walther, came to be called the American Luther. Elsewhere, I've tracked the rhetoric of the early Saxon Missourians in regard to what they hoped for in the United States. And while their polity may not have been drawn specifically from American democracy, their children would do that, they were not shy about seeing the United States as a place particularly well suited to confessional Lutheran activity. After all, Luther's Germany, as they would argue, did not offer Luther the opportunity to get polity right. America, however, did. And so we were able to go boldly where no Lutheran had gone before. And we did. So the problem remains. We trekked boldly into American culture, and as we did so, we brought a lot of baggage with us. The German language being the piece that we really had to pay extra for, particularly in the teens and in the 40s of the last century. So are we, as so many still say today, a German church? No, absolutely not. If we ever were, we've not been for some time. I would venture that most of us here do not speak German, and even fewer of us really spend time in that language in a meaningful way. Being able to say "Ein Bier bitte" does not make you a German speaker, any more than being able to say "Una cerveza fria, por favor" makes you a Spanish speaker. That's for later tonight. But that leaves the question, were we a German church? Linguistically, perhaps. But what about culturally? I think that's a better question. I would like to answer that we were never a German church in the strictest sense. Why? Because we're here in America, and we have always been American as a result. Yes, for a significant period of time we spoke German, and we tried to defend that, and yet, in time, we gave it up. But even before we gave it up, we had lived in and embraced American culture and found our place in the denominational setting. And so we find the problem once more. The LCMS has always been submerged in American culture, even as it has tried to hold that culture away. The Christian Century unwittingly captured this, in most cases it's unwitting when they get it right, in 1926. The Missouri Lutheran Church has its strength in the Middle West, the author wrote. It represents a distinctly American development in Lutheranism for which there is practically no parallel in Europe. It has isolated itself from other churches with an effectiveness that may be equaled by the Southern Baptists, but has not been surpassed by any other body. Its discipline is iron, and it enforces conformity to a theology which may best be described as an ossified 17th century orthodoxy. Its conception of salvation is highly magical, and the instruments of redemption are the sacraments and pure doctrine. Like Catholicism, it perpetuates itself through the parochial school. The rigid discipline of the church seems to be under the control of the theological seminary faculty, which has become a kind of corporate pope. Curiously enough, anti-Catholic feeling runs very high in this denomination, which is in many of its characteristics more closely akin to Catholicism than any other Protestant body, not excepting Anglicanism. The denomination has had a remarkable growth in America and numbers almost 1 million communicants. It has a missionary energy which unqualified denominational zeal always supplies. Its social influence on American life is very slight, and its ministers are prevented by the many restrictions which hedge them about from assuming a positive social leadership in the various communities where they labor. The church is almost as rigid and unbending as Rome, and it consciously isolates itself from other portions of American Protestantism. Well said. The problem is this: if the LCMS was truly isolated, how could it have grown into one of the top 10 American denominations within a century of its founding? The usual answer, immigration, doesn't solve that problem. For there were other immigrant churches that shared the same doctrinal platform, same fellowship practices, and same potential clientele. Sorry for that. And I'm here thinking, of course, of the Wisconsin Synod. And while Wisconsin grew, they grew neither as quickly nor nearly as much as Missouri. So, what was the key? To twist the old phrase, cur ali non, now we have kind of a confessional thing working here. Why Missouri and not others? My more modest first answer to that I'll offer this answer afternoon was Missouri's willingness to submerge itself fully in American culture. I've already tried to demonstrate that years ago in my little piece, Demography or Democracy, the Saxon Immigration in American Culture. Today I'm going to take a little different tact and jump into the 1960s. I didn't mean to do this originally. I was going to talk about a piece called While It Is Day by P.E. Kretzmann, published in 1926. And then I started watching YouTube, and everything went to pieces. But what I think this will show is that, indeed, part of the reason Missouri has succeeded and has experienced its struggles is the fact that it is willfully submerged in its culture. Many of you here likely have vivid memories of the profound changes that the United States experienced during the mid-1960s through the early 1970s. The civil rights movement, riots during long, hot summer, protests over the war in Vietnam, the Summer of Love, feminism, Woodstock, Wounded Knee, and plenty of others, all made the time a period unmatched in terms of turbulence and change in American history. For my part, some of my earliest and most distinct memories are of the unrest on the campus of The Ohio State University, where my parents were professors during the late 60s and where I first started school, which reached a peak in the immediate wake of the Kent State shootings on May 4th, 1970. This simply underscores the events that surrounded Kent State simply underscored the visible divisions within American culture, as one historian, Terry Anderson, has described them, quoting, "Obviously, the nation was becoming so divided by August 1968 that entirely different worldviews were emerging. Some people responded to frustration with anger, some with humor, some with silence. Some ignored the issue, others got drunk or stoned, and some used repression against those considered the enemy. Such responses were becoming apparent in mainstream society and in the movement. In a sense, then, Yippies were the most outrageous movement response to the overwhelming frustration of 1968, and for the establishment, the most outrageous response would be from Mayor Daley of Chicago. One of the ways in which the divisions in American culture showed themselves was on the college and university campuses, where students began to initiate a series of strikes. One of the most noteworthy was the student uprising at Columbia University, beginning in late April 1968 and going into the first part of May. Other instances of unrest followed, both in the United States and abroad, with students increasingly declaring strikes or moratoriums and simply refusing to attend class. One lesser known but significant instance of this occurred at San Francisco State College in Mill Valley, California, in late 1968 and then carried well into 1969. The San Francisco State College strike was one of the longest-lasting student strikes of the 1960s. It started when African American students confronted the college administration and demanded the establishment of an ethnic studies program. For nearly 5 months, beginning in November 68 and then into 1969, near anarchy at San Francisco State played out on national television as repeated confrontations between students and authorities reached the level of overt violence. As one historian summarized, it's remarkable that no one was killed. The strike had its genesis in the discontent of minority students who were angered over their lack of representation on the campus. Out of 20,000 students, there were about 700 blacks. As I mentioned, it began in November 68, and even though the strike was called at its opening, most students continued going to class. But strikers spread chaos on the campus by banging on classroom doors and threatening to forcibly remove students and teachers if they did not leave. They also cut the cords on typewriters, telephones, and copy machines in academic offices and clogged toilets and bathroom sinks. The place was a mess in more ways than one. Robert Smith, president of the college, responded by calling in hundreds of police in full riot gear. On November 13th, police interrupted a student demonstration and began to arrest students and other participants. Students responded by throwing rocks, and the situation quickly deteriorated. Smith quickly closed the campus. Governor Ronald Reagan and the California State University Board of Trustees, however, wanted the campus to remain open and ordered Smith to make arrangements. He refused and was replaced by S.I. Hayakawa on November 26th. Hayakawa, 5'3", and professor of semantics, had previously spoken out against the students, closed the school a day early on Thanksgiving, and then set the stage for a reopening on Monday, December 2nd, 1968. The campus reopened under a state of emergency. Hayakawa, himself a self-described liberal, immediately clashed with the radicals. He had no patience for what he believed were the theatrics of the protesters. He is quoted as saying, "In the age of television, image becomes more important than substance." There you go. And it seems he thought many of the student protesters were merely posers. Not sounding very liberal, Hayakawa went on to declare that I'm in this job for the continued existence of San Francisco State College, and I'm prepared to fight all the way. Hayakawa immediately banned protest, picketing, and the use of sound amplification. He came to national prominence quickly on December 2nd when he climbed aboard a truck that students had outfitted with a public address system and were using to condemn the actions of the college leadership. Hayakawa, again 5'3", and in this case wearing his trademark tam o'shanter, climbed aboard the truck, pulled the wires out, and rendered the PA useless. Governor Ronald Reagan is reported to have said, "I think we've found our man." He also called Hayakawa "my samurai." The following day, Tuesday, December 3rd, was a featured a whole series of incidents between students and police. Hayakawa ordered police to remove strikers who had assembled, what was becoming all too familiar in terms of the scenes at U.S. colleges and universities followed, with students denouncing administrations, police seeking to disperse the students, and police and students clashing in increasingly violent fashion, and cameras being there to record the whole thing. Here's a little snippet from a couple of reports in San Francisco on December 2nd, December 3rd. 1968. This is our school! Your parents are on strike, shut it down! 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 The strike continued, of course. It was finally resolved, and part of the resolution resulted in the formation of the Ethnic Studies, the College of Ethnic Studies, which not too many years ago celebrated its 40th anniversary at San Francisco State. One historian summarized the series of events that made up the San Francisco State College strike this way. Calm returned to San Francisco State during the spring semester, but the affair demonstrated how divided the campus and the nation had become by 1969. While there was some compromise, there was also little middle ground. Both sides were now digging in for the remainder of the second wave, an increasingly frustrated and bold student movement versus a more irritated silent majority that was demanding more repression. Indeed, San Francisco State was not alone. Not among colleges and universities, and not among seminaries. Throughout the spring of 1969, moratoriums were held around the country. They were largely, however, ad hoc in character. By October, there was a formal movement towards moratorium, and on October 15, 1969, a planned day off of classes for reflection on the war and how it might end was held. Bernard Weinraub of the New York Times reported that the day of moratorium on hundreds of college campuses began in the chill autumn dawn with memorial services and ended last night on city streets and college towns with silent candlelight marches to honor the nearly 40,000 American dead in Vietnam. Weinraub's report, which appeared in the New York Times, was titled, "Bells Toll and Crosses Are Planted Around the U.S. as Students Say Enough to War." And perhaps this, then, is the best point to make the transition back to LCMS events. Obviously, this is Concordia Seminary in St. Louis in 1974, where bells tolled and crosses were planted. Let's get to that point. We all know about the moratorium on classes that was called by St. Louis Seminary students, which began on January 21st, 1974, 40 years ago yesterday. However, when that occurred, they were continuing a tradition that had not only played out at places like San Francisco State, but in fact had been part of the seminary's experience since at least 1969. It showed just how deeply submerged in culture the students were. In Memoirs in Exile, John Teachin notes that students held a day of theological reflection in December 1973, and quoting here, as a practice that had been followed from time to time since 1969. That's a little misleading, frankly, for in fact, on February 10, 1969, CSL students petitioned for a 3-day moratorium on classes in the midst of the San Francisco State College strike. And they asked, some 250 students asked for the opportunity, quoting here, to discuss a number of student issues and grievances. The process they proposed went as follows. To respect the position of the students, the faculty proposed was followed. To begin discussions February 18th in small groups, to extend discussions up to the communion service on February 19th, to assess the program through a faculty-student committee Tuesday and Wednesday, which will undertake a further process if necessary, that the graduate school continues with such modifications as the instructor will deem possible. You see, at this point in time in 1969, the administration taking care of the problem by forming committees. Note to self. The minutes of the faculty sum things up this way, quoting again. After much discussion, the motion was made and seconded that the faculty offer up to 3 days for a procedure of discussion to be used at the discretion of the committee. The amendment was moved and seconded that the first phase of this be up to Wednesday chapel and the procedure thereafter be suggested by the committee. The motion carried. There was one, at least, negative vote, Martin Charlemagne. Later minutes showed a concern on the part of the faculty with student unrest and the historical record. In fact, President Feuerbringer recommended that the Department of Historical Theology provide a record of student unrest, the moratorium, and its context for future reference. There is an audio tape at the St. Louis Seminary Library of that. As student unrest over the United States' role in Vietnam increased, it's not surprising to find that the chief question in the moratorium discussion as it took place revolved around the seminary's certification to selective service regarding full-time students. The seminary reduced full-time from 15 hours to 12 at this point, yet there were questions over whether that was sufficient for students to be recognized as full-time. Particularly, the question emerged from the students, would they need to have 12 hours every quarter? In the end, the faculty resolved, quoting again, to authorize fourth-year men to drop 2 3-hour courses if necessary. That would have taken them down to 9. To add, and if necessary, to add additional credits reaching 12 hours through supplementary work in the courses in which they are enrolled. Further, President Feuerbringer was directed, and here's another quote, to check with the selective service on the legitimacy of averaging the course hours and to do so by next Tuesday if possible. Things were getting a little tense. Well, frankly, the moratorium initially came and went. Many questions were raised during that first moratorium. Many of them were pushed into the Student Life Committee. They were addressed as followed. The request for an annual moratorium was rejected. Instead, the faculty encouraged the entire campus community, quoting here, to rededicate ourselves to the primary task of theological education and service and personal Christian growth. For their part, the students admitted that part of the responsibility for the conditions we dislike lies with ourselves, and that we pledge in Christian love to rededicate ourselves to the goal of preparing to become ministers of the word, acting in love and honesty toward one another, whatever his position may be. They weren't fully radicalized yet, but they would become more so. The status quo largely remained in place, but larger events in the synod would change that. In May, John Teachin was elected president of the seminary. Teachin came from the Public Relations Office of the Lutheran Council USA and was a well-known moderate. He was well received by both faculty and students, generally speaking. There may be a couple of exceptions sitting over there. But generally. And then in July, J.A.O. Preuss, then president of Concordia Theological Seminary at Springfield, and a well-known conservative, unseated Oliver Harms as synod president. We were on the way towards conflict. If I may interrupt some things for just a moment here, well, I'm gonna. I'd like to insert a footnote on J.A.O. Preuss's election in 1969. There's a fair amount of speculation that has gone on over the years over just what Preuss's victory margin was. Tietjen is uncertain in his memoirs. Danker is convinced it was minimal in No Room in the Brotherhood. But in fact, in the elections, you had back then what was called a primary ballot because you had nominations on the floor of the convention. In the primary ballot, Preuss received 436 votes, and Oliver Harms received 417 out of 897 that were cast. That gives Preuss 48.6% of the votes, sorry about that, and Harms 46.4%. In the first formal ballot, Preuss received 465 votes. Harms dropped to 400 out of 933 cast. That means Jack Preuss had 49.8% on the first ballot. He came that close to a first ballot victory. And Harms was down to 42.8%. The second formal ballot was when Preuss went over the top, 471 votes to Harms' 416 out of 939 cast, giving Preuss 50.1% and Harms 44.3%. Well, just for the record, when Preuss was elected, Tietjen describes himself as troubled because, quoting Tietjen in the memoirs here, he had expected to work closely with Harms. Now I was to work with a president whose candidacy had been proposed by people within the Missouri Synod whose understanding of the church's theology and mission were different than mine. But actually, there were more immediate troubles than Jack Preuss for John Tietjen. First, he faced hostility, minimally, but nonetheless there, in the faculty. At the faculty's fall retreat in 1969, Tietjen's recently published article in the Concordia Theological Monthly, The Gospel in the Theological Task, formed the basis of reflection and discussion. One professor, Martin Charlemagne, expressed distress over the article's method and message. He responded with a piece called Some Animadversions on the Theme of the Retreat. Use that one in your sermon on Sunday. However, even prior to his November inauguration as president of the seminary, Tietjen was also pushed by the student body. David Carter, one of the editors of the student paper Spectrum, sought feedback from the administration on participating in the nationwide moratorium I mentioned before on October 15th. Tietjen temporized and asked that any such moratorium be postponed until at least November, when he might, quoting here, evaluate this matter with the faculty. Carter and the students respected the decision but remained unhappy. They felt, as they said, detached from the outside and expressed a need to be tuned in on the world. The faculty, ironically enough, was uncomfortable with the word moratorium, which they felt was a loaded term, and that the moratorium idea was too tied to the question of Vietnam. One faculty member went so far as to suggest that perhaps at least a total of 12 different books would have to be read before one could really sufficiently know about the war in Vietnam to make a judgment. That's a quote. They also wondered about, quoting again, the genuine concern that people have regarding the actions of seminary students and the effect these actions may have upon their respect for the seminary and their support of the same, something I totally resonate to. And they wondered and worried whether this matter was something in which the seminary should actually be involved. So instead, on October 21st, 1969, just after the national moratorium, the faculty considered a plan titled A Proposal to Designate November 13th, 1969 as a Day of Theological Reflection on Issues of War and Peace. It read as follows. Whereas President John Teachin has appointed a special student faculty committee for a day of theological reflection on issues of war and peace, and whereas the President has outlined the objectives of this committee as follows: to devise and implement a day's program approved by the faculty that will produce reflection on major current issues related to the Vietnam War and their implications for the church and its theology and ministry, and whereas the committee has agreed to recommend that Thursday, November 13th, 1969, be designated as the date for the proposed Day of Theological Reflection, and whereas all right, enough. What are the results? Be it resolved that the faculty designate Thursday, November 13th, as a day of theological reflection on issues of war and peace on the campus of Concordia Seminary. And be it further resolved that the program on that day include the following 4 topics. 1, selective conscientious objection. 2, civil disobedience. C, the church's ministry to people who differ on issues of national policy. And D, the war in Vietnam. Submerged in culture. My point in all of this is that the seminary students, like their colleagues at colleges and universities throughout the United States, were reacting to events in which they were deeply, deeply involved, and that they were becoming increasingly radicalized. Divisions were already readily apparent within the LCMS when members of the Ohio National Guard opened fire on students protesting the war at Kent State on May 4th, 1970. 4 students were tragically killed. Concordia students reacted by planning a vigil to recognize the seriousness of the event. Admittedly, there is a lack of clarity on the poster that you see here that supposedly announced the event, given that the Jackson State riots occurred on May 14th and 15th, 1970. In fact, whether this event actually occurred or not became a point of contention. When the original draft of the fact-finding committee report was shared with the seminary, it apparently addressed this issue. It did not, however, appear in the official report of September 1st, 1972, the so-called Blue Book. However, the revised text, and so Teachin, when he responded with his fact-finding or fault-finding, his response to Preuss's Blue Book on September 8th, 1972, he ironically introduced the issue of this unionistic service into the public record. So, in an addendum in fact-finding and fault-finding addressing the so-called Kent State and Jackson State memorial services, Teachin claimed the following: the President's committee did not even do us the courtesy of finding out the facts on which it is supposedly reporting. It is reporting as fact what did not in fact occur. There was no all-night vigil. There was no service in the Central Quadrangle. There was no joint worship. The announced event was canceled. Why didn't the committee find out what really happened? They would have one less case against the seminary. However, Tom Baker challenged that assertion. In his Watershed at the Rivergate, he noted that when several students read what had been written in fact-finding, they sent a letter to the persons most affected by Dr. Teachin's charge. And he cites that letter, quoting, that a service of worship, speaking to God, hearing him respond, took place, that a service of worship took place, cannot be denied. Although technically it did not take place in the quad, such a cop-out seems to miss the real issue. It did take place. President Teachin and other professors, Kalin, Klein, were present and took part in speaking the worship litany. Women, presumably from Fontbonne, were present, unionism, and there were those present who continued to remain awake during the whole night discussing the issues and taking action. Witness, I myself remained with one group until 6 in the morning, while another group spent their vigil in enclosing the quad with barbed wire. By the way, this is continuing the quote. After the service, one of the speakers thanked President Teachin for attending at that time. President Teachin made comments to the effect that he thanked this group for their work and thought that more of the students should be made aware of the war and its effect. His amiable personality and smiling countenance gave witness to the fact that he certainly did not disapprove of what was going on. That's one of the fun things about being historian. You get these absolutely contradictory pieces of evidence that you have to deal with. And so we move on. What is clear? What is clear, however, is a picture that appeared in the Spectrum itself, in the May 8th, 1970 Spectrum. So just a few days after, I think it's May, it might be May 6th, a couple of days after Kent State. In an act that mirrored what was happening in institutions of higher education throughout the United States, Concordia students placed crosses in the quad of the campus in honor of those slain. You see this ongoing imagery of crosses planted and also reflecting the wine rob piece from earlier, the bells tolling. As the school year moved towards its close, the Spectrum continued to feature calls for action and increasingly expressions of frustration on the part of some students. One issue of encouragement appeared in the form of a letter co-authored by Mark O. Hatfield, a Republican from Oregon, Charles Goodell, a Republican from New York, Alan Cranston, a Democrat from California, and Harold Hughes, Democrat from Iowa, encouraging students to, quote, do all in your power to generate public support in order to cut off further funding for the war, withdraw the troops, exchange prisoners, and offer asylum to those who feel threatened in the face of the proposed U.S. withdrawal. Commentary on the letter expressed exasperation within the student body. Everybody's talking, but no one is acting, said one writer. Here's a chance to be a constructive participant. Act for once. The same issue featured the announcement that Bill Durkin, a member of the Chicago 15 anti-war protesters, would be speaking on the campus that same day, and included a long statement by Durkin where he stated, quoting again, every court struggle is the same battle between those who want to be free and those who want to keep them enslaved. The dialogue is different, but the struggle is the same. In the same issue, correspondent R. Ballant answered the question posed by an earlier correspondent when he wrote, won't someone bring us together? They've tried, Ballant responded. Jesus, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, but we didn't listen. We have God's own son, the Mahatma, a 20th century saint, and many, many more. If someone were to return from the dead, we would not hear him. Subsequent editions of the Spectrum encouraged students to participate in the boycott march against California table grapes, Cesar Chavez organizing that, to work for social justice, and to help fight discrimination. Seminarians even found themselves citing long passages from Saul Alinsky that derided liberals and incited radicalism in their letters to the editor. Larry R. Brakenhoff included Alinsky's statement as food for thought, which included the statement that there is a difference, a striking difference between a liberal and a radical. The difference between a liberal and a radical is that the liberal is the one who walks out of the room when the argument turns into a fight. So much for Missouri's moderates calling themselves that. They were losing their audience. However, perhaps the strongest indication of the students being deeply distressed and deeply immersed simultaneously in the emerging revolutionary culture came from a letter written by a student named Dan Kunkel. He writes this: I went to Washington on the dollars of friends. I joined in rallies, got tear gas, took pictures, talked to policemen and demonstrators, visited senators, representatives, and their offices, slept on floors, walked blocks, and returned. The Southeast Asian War still goes on in the green paddies and brown hills and the muddy waters. Concordia Seminary still goes on behind the green lawns and the brown walls and the muddy minds of us all. Will there come a time when saying no to one means saying no to the other? Or am I to retreat once again behind church and state, rich and poor, establishment and movement, professor and student, violence and nonviolence, law and gospel, simply because life is that way? I saw graves of dead men in Washington beside the Potomac and the Pentagon. I'm sorry, but I returned to see the walking dead between the DeMun and Big Bend in Clayton. It's not that I don't have some perspective, it's my eyes. They're tiring under the strain of constant short-sightedness. I guess I'm just not the right type for handling the seminary's vision for the world. There's just too many minutes for thinking between the Pentagon and 210 North Broadway, the old Synod headquarters address. I'm sorry, brothers and sisters. The greens and the browns and muddy waters around here keep showing Pax Americana. And, of course, Americana is spelled with a K. All of this was 4 years before the walkout. It was, however, contemporaneous with the catalyst for the walkout, one might say, namely President J.A.O. Preuss's announcement in July 1970 that he intended to investigate the seminary. For many students, it simply seemed that Nixon and Preuss were one and the same. And when Preuss preached at the White House, I think they were utterly convinced. When things heated up to the boiling point over the next several years, things did heat up over the next several years. And a careful study of the spectrum, which was really a remarkable paper, frankly, where you had students, administrators, you had everybody getting into the show with that thing. Looking at this over the next several years shows how deeply seminarians were submerged in their culture. It's not a theological assessment, it's a historical one. They reflected their deep immersion in the cultural upheaval of their time. Spectrum continued to be a vibrant place of interaction between moderate students and conservative students, between professors and students, between professors and professors, and even between the Board of Control and Synod administration and seminary administration and students and professors. Like I said, everybody got in the act. The whole campus was engaged. As Preuss's fact-finding committee continued its process, tensions heightened. Arliss Ehlen's contract was not renewed. Demands for the rationale for this act were not addressed. The faculty responded to Preuss's A Statement of Scriptural and Confessional Principles negatively. The Board of Control exonerated all faculty members, some by the barest of margins. The 1973 New Orleans Convention resolved that the faculty held positions that were not to be tolerated in the Church of God. The faculty issued a formal protest, a declaration of protest and confession on July 24, 1974, and sounding increasingly radicalized, they said, "We protest the convention's judgment that we teach false doctrine which cannot be tolerated in the Church of God. We protest the convention's violation of procedures for evangelical discipline, clearly outlined in the Synod's constitution and bylaws. We protest the convention's breach of contract in judging and condemning us by a doctrinal standard different from the doctrinal article of the Constitution. We protest the convention's violation of the principle of sola scriptura in elevating tradition above the Scriptures. We protest the convention's use of coercive power to establish the true doctrine of the Scriptures. We protest the convention's unconstitutional act of altering the Synod's confessional standard." The Board of Control suspended John Tietjen in August 1974, then vacated the suspension. In November 1974, Paul Gedding's contract was not renewed, and also 5 seasoned professors were retired. One of them, Arthur Carl Peepcorn, died shortly thereafter. To say things were tense would be an understatement. And then things came to a head. On Sunday, January 20th, 1974, at about 10 p.m., the news emerged that the Board of Control had formally acted to suspend John Tietjen as president of Concordia Seminary, effective immediately. Martin Charlemagne was named acting president. The following day, Monday, January 21st, 1974, Tietjen issued his document titled Evidence, in which he sought to demonstrate the duplicity of the Board of Control, especially J.A.O. Preuss. More importantly, however, that same day, students gathered at about 10 a.m., and as the AAUP put it, of almost 300 students, about half the student body, declared a moratorium on attending classes. Here they are gathered in the chapel to vote. The resolution itself basically made the point that members of the faculty majority, having been accused of publicly teaching false doctrine, which is not to be tolerated in the Church of God, but not having been publicly identified, that the students were uncertain which ones were which, and therefore they would not attend class. And so therefore they resolved to declare a moratorium on all classes until such time as the Seminary Board of Control officially and publicly declares which members of the faculty, if any, are to be considered as false teachers, and what scriptural and confessional principles, if any, have been violated. To spend our class hours until the Seminary Board of Control informs us of its decisions, communicating to the Board of Control and to the Synod at large what we have been taught at this seminary, especially the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. 3, to complete our academic requirements for those classes, which we will miss according to the procedures which are acceptable to those who are responsible for course accreditation. They've concluded and summarized, we make this resolve mindful of the possible consequences of our actions and asking God's blessing upon our labors. Part of the consequences, of course, being that their kids would be affected as well. You can see the side that says, we are behind our fathers. The faculty followed suit, and 40 years ago today, informed President Preuss that the Board of Control of Concordia Seminary has emptied the classrooms and silenced the teaching of the Word of God on our campus. That wasn't quite true. 5 professors were part of the faculty minority, 4 of whom were actively continuing to teach during this period, including Robert Preuss. I did have a picture of him in here teaching about 4 students, but somehow it didn't appear in here. I apologize for that. But the letter of the faculty majority tacitly recognized the students' moratorium. Interestingly enough, however, they defined their action in terms of the person of John Tejan. That is, they said by condemning President Tejan's confessional stand and suspending him from office, the Board of Control has condemned our own confession and has suspended all of us from our duties as teachers and executive staff members. The board disagreed. And when the faculty majority refused to return to the seminary classrooms by Monday, February 18, 1974, they were terminated. In what in some ways might be viewed as the last flowerings of the 60s protest movement, the students, faculty, and administration of Concordia Seminary walked out. Some would insist exiled, but I think that's far too passive for a group like this. They walked out of the campus at 8:01 Demun at about midday, February 19, 1974. The event was well choreographed, as pictures and videos show, and the tolling of bells and the planting of crosses linked this event to earlier protests of the movement, though I must admit that the students were more responsible and articulate in presenting their case than in many of the earlier instances. Some familiar pictures, the students in the field house, voting to go into exile, making their way into the quad to plant crosses, planting the crosses as well. The famous picture I've already shown you of the crosses planted in the quad. Walther Arch boarded up with the words exiled, the boards left there. And then a little more video.
Continue to pursue our calling as students in preparation for ministry in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod under the terminated faculty. We believe they are innocent of any charges of false doctrine and in fact are faithful to the Holy Scriptures and the Lutheran confessions. We therefore resolve to resume our theological education in exile, trusting in the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
And as we look back to that mighty fortress, we know these words are true. But we also know that there was one who went outside the camp. We're pilgrims, brothers and sisters. That's what we are as God's people. We'd like to have a nice, safe refuge somewhere to call our home, but we have no continuing city anywhere here. Lord Jesus Christ died outside the city so that he might bring into existence that city which is to come. The city is in the process of coming now. We are part of it, living stones in God's temple, and we share together in that holy city of our God with our brothers and sisters in Christ at Eden Seminary and at St. Louis University Divinity School. Together, we share a common faith. Together, we put our trust in God, and we let him lead us where he will. We know we can count on him. Amen.
Much of that video, actually, you can find it on YouTube. It's from a couple of pieces that have been prepared by the archives of the ELCA. And the problem of the long piece they have on YouTube is that it's chronologically a disaster. Everything's mixed up, so you really have to pay careful attention as you make your way through it. But nonetheless, it's interesting watching, to say the least. In conclusion, I could have chosen a number of examples to make my point about Lutheranism being submerged in culture. Walther's 4th of July address of 1853 to a student youth group, Pieper's wonderful The Layman's Movement in the Bible in the teens, John Bankin's unfortunate tent meetings in the American Lutheran, or one I actually, as I mentioned, started out with for this paper, P.E. Kretzmann's ghastly, While It Is Day, a manual for soul winners. I can promise you this, no matter what next year's symposium theme is, I'll make Kretzmann's piece the center of my presentation. Got to get that done. But I chose Concordia Seminary purposefully for obvious reasons, hopefully by now. The fact that we are 40 years from the events and turmoil of 1974, and over the next month we'll recognize a whole series of anniversaries that underscore just how deeply we are submerged and immersed in our culture. The main line is collapsing, and some have also predicted that evangelicalism may collapse. It's not good news for Lutherans, frankly, either way. The strange irony is that the ELCA is better poised for acceptance by American culture presently than the LCMS, and yet in what appears to be the coming anti-Christian future, sycophantically assimilating certain characteristics of the dominant culture will not save the church. Of that, I am certain. So the next time, as you wring your hands over how submerged in culture your Lutheran congregation is, remember, you're in the deep end of the pool, too. We all are. That's just the way it is. The real question is whether and how we will swim in it. So thank you very much for your attention this hour.